Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to continue with question 6b of the post-Bacc Econs H2 paper. Assess appropriate policies that Singapore can adopt to overcome these macro problems. If you have done 6a, then you would know that these macro problems relate to external challenges that have caused unemployment. Right? It also talks about external challenge that talks about how economic growth has worsened, slowing economic growth, and you would probably be able to link to how balance of trade has been worsening, right? And you probably might also talk about how there could be some problems with inflation related to with the imported inflation of raw materials from overseas. Right, so this is a very standard question. Assess appropriate policies, right? Obviously, you need to talk about more than one, right? And in this case, I would suggest three policies, right? Only in talking about three policies can we have a good comparison, right? And emphasizing on the role of each of the policies that could deal with the macro problems that were described in part A, right? And just a quick recap, we talked about how part A, that was imported inflation. We talked how there was a slowing economic growth in our trade partners. And yeah, so these policies have to deal with those problems which are externally caused. Right, so typically Singapore adopts three broad categories of policies, right? In demand management policies, we can link to exchange rate policy, right? And then we can also talk about what are some fiscal measures that they use, fiscal policies, right? So we have 1 and 2 here. And of course, to show our understanding in our macro policies, we also want to have breadth of our examples. So we will also talk about supply side policies, right? Whether you want to talk about interventionist or market-oriented, I leave that up to you. But basically, the example that you choose should be most appropriate in dealing with the macro problems that you have identified in part A. Okay, so it's a typical question, right? Assess the appropriate policies requires you to talk about three policies to deal with the different macro problems that you have described. So in this question, they don't say a particular macro problem like price stability, right? They want you to talk about all. So you need to mention how they tackle the different macro problems all together. Okay, of course, what is more challenging is that students find it hard or difficult to determine what is evaluation. And I always say that a good place to start, right, is to look at the command word. The command word is to say assess if they can overcome, right? So basically, this first of all, not evaluation yet, gives you your thesis and your antithesis, or your argument and counter argument, right? That you are supposed to explain how policy overcomes these macro problems. And then you're supposed to talk about the limitations of those policies in overcoming that particular macro challenge, right? Then from there, then we can start to identify what are some common criteria that we will use in measuring the effectiveness of the policies, right, or the appropriateness of the policies, right? And here are some typical ones, right? We can look at whether the policy is immediate, right? How fast before we see the effects of overcoming the macro problems, or is it relevant, right, in the sense that it suits the root cause of the problem that Singapore is facing today? Is it sustainable, right? Does it help to overcome the problem even in the long run, right? So these are some examples of criteria that we can use as we are writing our essay, or at the end, right, when we are comparing the policies together and making a judgment of as a whole on which one is the most important or how do they all complement each other. Okay, so that's the breakdown of the question. Be sure that you are going to talk about 3 policies. Be sure that your policies should tackle the various macro problems and not just one type of macro problems. Be sure that you will have balance in your answer. You need to talk about how they are good and how they are limited in its effectiveness. And then the more important part, lastly, is to give an evaluation based on different criteria on what we consider appropriate. Okay, so I will now move on to the structure of the essay. So for a 3 policy question kind of structure, it's very standard, right? Whatever context you're given, first you would want to establish in your introduction about the background of economy that we are looking at, and in this case it is Singapore. Actually, we already did a bit of the background in question A, so you might not want to repeat so much about it, right? You also want to give an overview of the different macro policies that you will be discussing, right? In this case, exchange rate policy could be the modest and gradual appreciation, fiscal policies, and then supply side, right? So you talk about how your essay will focus on some demand management policies and some supply side policies. So this primes the reader to know that hey, you're considering the bigger picture, right? You know that you are he knows that you're going to cover different types of policies. Okay, then of course in our second paragraph we will start with our first policy, right? And for a typical policy question, it's always like that, right? Policy A, and let's say the first policy is exchange rate policy. Okay, but what should we write in this paragraph? Right, so how do we ensure that a paragraph is good? Firstly, what the Cambridge examiners are looking for is, firstly, they want your economic explanation of how it works to solve whatever macro problem that you're talking about. So if you're talking about exchange rate policy, then you will talk about how the gradual and modest appreciation deals with imported inflation. Of course, you don't just state that it deals with it, but you have to explain economically, right? How does it change the currency, and then from the currency alter the relative prices of goods and services bought from overseas. So you need to have a detailed economic explanation, right? Thereafter, you will also bring in the limitations, right? So you need to talk about how this policy is limited in its effect. Of course, I'm not going to talk about what the limitations are now. Okay, I'm just giving you the structure. For more information about how the answer can be written and the different content that can be used to be elaborated in this question, you would have to go to the suggested answers, right? One thing I like to do before I move on to the next policy is a very important step, right? Is to link to the next policy. So what limitations does exchange rate policy have that necessitates, right, another policy, right? And that's the reason why you want to bring in that policy. So you must find a way to have a linking statement, right? And usually the linking statement is related to some limitations that exchange rate policy cannot solve, right? And then that brings you to your next policy, right? Instead of compartmentalizing each policy, policy A, B, C, and then talk about them separately. Okay, then obviously you will bring in your second policy. And in this case, let's say we talk about fiscal policies. So in the first policy, it tends to focus on the imported inflation, right? But that could result in some negative effect on economic growth. Therefore, you also need fiscal policy, right, to support the exchange rate policy. So again, right, important step is your economic explanation of how it works, right? Same as above, right? You always have same steps in your paragraph. Explain how it works first using economic analysis like ADAS. For fiscal policy, it will be good to give real examples of the type of fiscal policy that Singapore uses. Don't just say, oh, they increase spending G or they decrease the tax rate, right? What sort of tax rates do they decrease in Singapore? What sort of spending does the government spend on, particularly to deal with these kind of macro problems that were highlighted in part A, right? Then after that, we will give the limitations, same steps, and then the link to the next policy, right? However, fiscal policy only deals with the short run problem, right? But the root cause of the problem, perhaps you have mentioned, is that Singapore's resources are not as competitive as before, and therefore you need supply side policies, right? So my point is you try to link to your next policy. So in your third policy, you will bring in supply side policy. Again, you want to explain how the policy works, right? Just like the above. And then you want to give real life examples related to Singapore. So I'll be talking about a reduction in business regulation to foster competition, or I'll be talking about training and rescaling of workers so that they are always employable in any industries, right? Then after that, we talk about the limitations. So all these are the content. If you want more details, again, I stress you should read the suggested answer. But it's important, right, when you start the essay, that you have a framework in mind, that we talk about 3 policies and we try to ensure that in each policy we have, firstly, economic explanation, that's the technical explanation. Then you give real life example, that's your contextualization, and then your limitations, right, which is actually your counter argument, how you balance the essay, right? And of course, the last paragraph, we will leave it to our evaluation, right? And this evaluation should be based on criteria, right, which we talked about just now. Oh, which one is more effective in the short run? Which one is more effective in the long run? Which one tackles the root cause of the problem? Which one is more sustainable? So the thing about these kind of questions, or questions that talk about 3 policies, like they ask you which is the best policy, is that there is never really one best, but each of them are important in their own way. So having a criteria tells you or helps you emphasize how are each of them important, right? And in doing so, subconsciously, you can also, in your evaluation, explain how they complement each other, right? That's also another form of evaluation, such that they deal with the problem differently. So for example, I could mention that exchange rate policy uh, focuses mainly on imported inflation, right? However, this policy should always be a fundamental policy, whether in good times or bad, right? The fact that the nature of our economy, Singapore, demands that exchange rate policy, right? Whether good or bad times, right? So the nature of the economy has already necessitated exchange rate policy. But you can also talk about how the exchange rate policy um, is tackling more imported inflation, a particular type of macro goal, and therefore fiscal policies, right, are also needed in place to cushion the impacts, the short-term impacts that are happening in the global economy, right? So when there's economic growth and inflation, you want to use fiscal policy to control the situation, right, as a cushion effect. Or when there is a recession, you want to use fiscal policy to boost the economy, right? So exchange rate policy is like a fundamental policy because of our characteristics. Fiscal policy is to cushion the impacts of the macro challenges. And then supply side policy is the policy which is more sustainable to ensure the competitiveness of Singapore continues, right? To ensure that workers become employable no matter what industry. So that's how we explain how they complement each other. Not just say they complement each other. How do they complement each other is what we want to see in the evaluation. Okay, so that is all for this question. For more information on how to write the answer in prose and the different content points that you could write and detail in each policy, please refer to the suggested answer given to you. Okay, goodbye.